Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, where Becket had been murdered in 1170. Whether Chaucer did indeed go on such a religious journey or not, he certainly could. The Prologue from the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, translated by Neville Coghill.
Chaucer wrote in what we now call Middle English. The first 18 lines of the prologue are presented here in Middle English, followed by the entire prologue in a modern translation. One that April with his sure resorte, the drocht of March hath persed to the rote, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. One Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath the tendre croppus, and the younge sunne hath in the ram his half-course rune, and smalle fooles maken melodie, that slepen all the nicht with open ear. So pricketh hem natuur in hier courages, than longen folk to gon on pilgrimages, and palmares for to seken strange strondes, to ferne halwas, couth in sundry londes. And specially, from every sheeres ende of Engeland, to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seke, that hem hath halpen, one that they were seke. When, in April, the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. When also Zephyrus, with his sweet breath, exhales an air in every grove and heath upon tender shoots, and the young sun his half-course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them and their heart engages, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints, hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end in England down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give his help to them when they were sick. It happened in that season that one day in Southwark, at the Tabard, as I lay ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into that hostelry some 29 in a company of sundry folk, happening then to fall in fellowship, and they were pilgrims all, that towards Canterbury meant to ride. The rooms and stables of the inn were wide, they made us easy, all was of the best. And shortly, when the sun had gone to rest, by speaking to them all upon the trip, I soon was one of them in fellowship, and promised to rise early and take the way to Canterbury, as you heard me say. But nonetheless, while I have time and space before my story takes a further pace, it seems a reasonable thing to say what their condition was, the full array of each of them, as it appeared to me, according to profession and degree, and what apparel they were riding in. And at a night I therefore will begin. There was a knight, a most distinguished man, who, from the day on which he first began to ride abroad, had followed chivalry, truth, honour, generousness, and courtesy. He had done nobly in his sovereign's war, and ridden into battle, no man more, as well in Christian as heathen places, and ever honoured for his noble graces. When we took Alexandria, he was there. He often sat at table in the chair of honour above all nations when in Prussia. In Lithuania he had ridden, and Russia, no Christian man so often of his rank. When, in Granada, Algeciras sank under assault, he had been there, and in North Africa, raiding Benamarin. In Anatolia he had been as well, and fought when Aias and Italia fell. For all along the Mediterranean coast he had embarked, with many a noble host. In 15 mortal battles he had been, and jousted for our faith at Tramesin thrice in the lists, and always killed his man. This same distinguished knight had led the van once, with the Bey of Belat, doing work for him against another heathen Turk. He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished, he was wise, and in his bearing modest as a maid. He never yet a boorish thing had said in all his life to any, come what might. He was a true, a perfect, gentle knight. Speaking of his equipment, he possessed fine horses, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a fustian tunic, stained and dark with smudges where his armour had left mark. Just home from service, he had joined our ranks to do his pilgrimage and render thanks. He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In stature, he was of a moderate length, with wonderful agility and strength. He'd seen some service with the cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, and had done valiantly, in little space of time, in hope to win his lady's grace. He was embroidered like a meadow, bright and full of freshest flowers, red and white. Singing he was, or fluting all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, the sleeves were long and wide. He knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He could make songs and poems and recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. He loved so hotly that, till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. There was a yeoman with him at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and hood of green, and peacock-feathered arrows, bright and keen and neatly sheathed, hung at his belt the while. For he could dress his gear in yeoman style, his arrows never drooped their feathers low. And in his hand he bore a mighty bow. His head was like a nut, his face was brown. He knew the whole of woodcraft up and down. A saucy brace was on his arm, to ward it from the bowstring, and a shield and sword hung at one side, and at the other slipped a jaunty dirk, spear-sharp and well-equipped. A medal of St. Christopher he wore, of shining silver on his breast, and bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. There also was a nun, a prioress. Her way of smiling very simple and coy. Her greatest oath was only, "By Saint Loy!" And she was known as Madame Eglentine. And well she sang a service, with a fine intoning through her nose, as was most seemly, and she spoke daintily in French, extremely, after the school of Stratford at Bow, French in the Paris style she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught withal, no morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dipped her fingers in the sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lip so clean that not a trace of grease was to be seen upon the cup when she had drunk. To eat, she reached a hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, a stately bearing fitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. As for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous, she used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap if it were dead or bleeding. And she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh, or milk, or fine white bread. And bitterly she wept if one were dead, or someone took a stick and made it smart. She was all sentiment and tender heart. Her veil was gathered in a seemly way, her nose was elegant, her eyes glass grey. Her mouth was very small, but soft and red. Her forehead certainly was fair of spread, almost a span across the brows, I own. She was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had a graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads, the gaudies, tricked in green, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and lower, amor vincit omnia. Another nun, the chaplain at her cell, was riding with her, and 3 priests as well. A monk there was, one of the finest sort, who rode the country. Hunting was his sport. A manly man, to be an abbot able. Many a dainty horse he had in stable. His bridle, when he rode, a man might hear jingling in a whistling wind, as clear, aye, and as loud as does the chapel bell where my lord monk was prior of the cell. The rule of good St. Bennet or St. Maur, as old and strict, he tended to ignore. He let go by the things of yesterday, and took the modern world's more spacious way. He did not rate that text at a plucked hen which says that hunters are not holy men, and that a monk uncloistered is a mere fish out of water, flapping on the pier, that is to say, a monk out of his cloister. That was a text he held not worth an oyster, and I agreed, and said his views were sound. Was he to study till his head went round, poring over books in cloisters? Must he toil as Austin bade, and till the very soil? Was he to leave the world upon the shelf? Let Austin have his labour to himself. This monk was, therefore, a good man to horse. Greyhounds he had, as swift as birds, to course. Hunting a hare or riding at a fence was all his fun. He spared for no expense. I saw his sleeves were garnished at the hand with fine grey fur, the finest in the land. And on his hood, to fasten it at his chin, he had a wrought gold, cunningly fashioned pin into a lover's knot, it seemed to pass. His head was bald and shone like looking-glass. So did his face, as if it had been greased. He was a fat and personable priest. His prominent eyeballs never seemed to settle. They glittered like the flames beneath a kettle. Supple his boots, his horse in fine condition. He was a prelate fit for exhibition. He was not pale like a tormented soul. He liked a fat swan best, and roasted whole. His palfrey was as brown as is a berry. There was a fra, a wanton one and merry, a limiter, a very festive fellow. In all 4 orders there was none so mellow, so glib with gallant phrase and well-turned speech. He'd fixed up many a marriage, giving each of his young women what he could afford her. He was a noble pillar to his order. Highly beloved and intimate was he with county folk within his boundary, and city dames of honour and possessions, for he was qualified to hear confessions, or so he said, with more than priestly scope. He had a special licence from the Pope. Sweetly he heard his penitents at shrift with pleasant absolution for a gift. He was an easy man in penance-giving, where he could hope to make a decent living. It's a sure sign whenever gifts are given to a poor order that a man's well shriven, and should he give enough, he knew in verity the penitent repented in sincerity. For many a fellow is so hard of heart he cannot weep, for all his inward smart. Therefore, instead of weeping and of prayer, one should give silver for a poor friar's care. He kept his tippet stuffed with pins for curls, and pocket-knives to give to pretty girls. And certainly his voice was gay and sturdy, for he sang well, and played the hurdy-gurdy. At sing-songs he was champion of the hour. His neck was whiter than a lily-flower, but strong enough to butt a bruiser down. He knew the taverns well in every town, and every innkeeper and barmaid too, better than lepers, beggars, and that crew. For in so eminent a man as he, it was not fitting with the dignity of his position, dealing with a scum of wretched lepers. Nothing good can come of dealings with the slum and gutter dwellers, but only with the rich and victual sellers. But anywhere a profit might accrue, courteous he was, and lowly of service too. Natural gifts like his were hard to match. He was the finest beggar of his batch, and for his begging district paid a rent. His brethren did no poaching where he went. For though a widow mightn't have a shoe, so pleasant was his holy how-d'ye-do, he got his farthing from her just the same before he left, and so his income came to more than he laid out. And how he romped just like a puppy. He was ever prompt to arbitrate disputes on settling days, for a small fee, in many helpful ways. Not then appearing as your cloistered scholar with threadbare habit hardly worth $1, but much more like a doctor or a pope. Of double worsted was the semi-cope upon his shoulders, and the swelling fold about him, like a bell about its mould when it is casting, rounded out his dress. He lisped a little out of wantonness, to make his English sweet upon his tongue. When he had played his harp, or having sung, his eyes would twinkle in his head as bright as any star upon a frosty night. This worthy's name was Hubert, it appeared. There was a merchant with a forking beard and motley dress. High on his horse he sat. Upon his head a Flemish beaver hat, and on his feet daintily buckled boots. He told of his opinions and pursuits in solemn tones, and how he never lost. The sea should be kept free at any cost, he thought, upon the Harwich-Holland range. He was expert at currency exchange. This estimable merchant so had set his wits to work, none knew he was in debt. He was so stately in negotiation, loan, bargain, and commercial obligation. He was an excellent fellow all the same. To tell the truth, I do not know his name.